Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. Last week, I painted a really cool beholder miniature, and I said that it was going to be part of an upcoming project. Well, I think 1 week of suspense is enough, so I'm now going to reveal exactly what that project is. I mean, you may have already read the title of this video, so you probably know, but I'm going to be making a book nook. And what you're seeing on screen right now is me putting together some of the core components of this book nook that I've ordered. It all starts with the laser cut wooden structure, which I'm choosing to leave the top and the side off of for now because I know that I'm going to need access to be able to paint things and glue things inside of this structure, so I absolutely can't stick everything together now or I'll struggle to get my fingers in it the whole way through the project. This video is going to be about painting the rest of the miniatures, but before I do that, I wanted to show my rough plans for how I wanted to put everything together for this book nook. I'm going to be using the beholder I painted from last week, but I'm also going to be using this giant piece of terrain, which is a big archway with some stairs and rocks. It's an awesome piece of terrain, and I'm going to be painting it in the next video after this one. I wanted to place that piece 2/3 of the way to the back of the book nook, and then I'm going to start putting some stuff in front of it. This is the first of the characters that's going to go in my diorama. This hooded, heavy armored magic-y person that I'm going to headcanon as a wizard is the main villain of this scene. So I placed him where I was roughly planning that he would go, and then it was time to introduce you to the 2 other characters in the scene. These are the heroes, turned up to save the day. They're both DnD miniatures from Nolz's Marvelous Miniatures range, and one is a human paladin, the other is an orc fighter. They're going to be placed in the scene to look like they're about to run at and engage with our main villain, and behind the villain, I'm going to be putting the beholder I painted last time. That is roughly what the scene will look like, what I'm holding at the moment, and we're going to be working on that over the next few weeks to finish up this book nook and create what is hopefully going to be a really epic scene when it's done. So as I mentioned, the miniatures are up first this week, and I'll be doing more of the terrain and those kinds of bits next week. So the first miniature on the chopping block is the wizard, and you might be saying, oh, he doesn't look like a wizard, he looks more like a paladin, and he probably does, but I need him to be a wizard, and the main reason for that is that if you dive into deep D&D lore, which I did this week in my research about this diorama, then the main way to mind control a beholder is to use the dream spell, and only wizards and sorcerers can do that. So if you need to for the lore, then imagine he's multiclassing paladin and wizard or something like that. That explains the heavy armor and his magic-iness. So what you've been watching me paint in these clips behind while I've been rambling on is what I would refer to as like the undergarments, the bits under all of the rest of the armor and stuff. And I've been doing that with a grey. I've been using my classic charcoal, mixing up to lighter greys for highlights on this. There isn't a whole load of this over the miniature, it's very small. I didn't want it to stand out, which is why I've gone for greys initially. I just did some quick and easy edge highlights and lined up the grey a little bit on the front parts, and then I called that part done. Next up is a lovely set of brown paints from the Army Painter Fanatic range, and I'm going to be using those to paint all of his leather straps. This character has way too many straps and belts. He's got like 3 layers of belt straps, and it's crazy, I don't know, it looks cool, so that's a plus, but it must be a nightmare to try and wear all of that. I work up through the 3 paints that I just showed, going from the darkest to the lightest and different layers, adding a smaller amount each time. So while I paint this guy's strapping belts up, let me talk a little bit about how I got this idea and why I decided to do it. So a couple of weeks back, I was doing this Squig diorama, and that diorama was really cool, and I wanted to make sure that I could do something on the channel that was completely different to that diorama, but still had an epic feel about it. And I was coming up with ideas, and I was looking around, and I stumbled across the idea of a book nook. Once the idea was in my head, I couldn't really let it go, and that was it. I kind of knew that I had to make a book nook. The problem with a book nook, however, is that there's a very specific structure for the whole shape of the diorama, and that is that it's normally quite tall, it's quite deep, and it's very thin. That meant that I needed to find a scene that would fit that shape. So I actually spent time over a couple of weeks trying to think of the perfect, or at least a good idea for this book nook. In the end, what helped me choose what I'm currently working on was looking through Etsy shops and finding bits of terrain. It was the big archway terrain that I found that gave me this idea. So here, just going back to the video clips, this is what the final leather looks like at this point. Now it's time to move on to the armor, and I wanted his armor to be mostly a steel, sort of silvery metallic, And I thought I'd be ambitious and try this as a non-metallic metal. I do not claim to be an expert at non-metallic metal at this point, and I'm still working on it, so this was good practice. For this non-metallic metal, I basically just used the AK 3rd Gen non-metallic metal set of paints. In that set of paints, you go from anthracite grey up to graphite, then you use silver grey, and then up to white for your highlights. It's a really good paint set, and it can help you focus less on which paints to choose and more on how to blend them or place them in the right places with the highlights. I am probably going to do a dedicated video on just studying a load of non-metallic metal and putting it into practice, because it's just one of those techniques I really want to build my confidence on and to really become good at. And the only way I'm going to be able to do that is if I do it a lot. And I'm not painting much outside of the videos that I'm producing, so I need to do a video on it. And hopefully if I do that, a load of people might find it useful, because I might be able to share some tips that might help them improve their non-metallic metal as well. Placement of highlights is really, really important with the light colors, so like the silver grey in this set. And I'm really working on exactly where to put those, especially for the shapes. Obviously, I was thinking of the legs and the arms as cylinders, so the lines of the highlights generally go down the middle of those. And I was thinking about the chest as more of a sort of rounded shape, so it's kind of more of like a spot highlight up in the top corners. But I still definitely have a lot of room to improve with my placement of highlights, and especially my like smoothing of my layers. I actually think, upon analysis of this, going just a little bit smaller on the intense highlights, maybe having them be just tiny dots instead of the kind of patches that I've made them, would probably be better as well. So I'm going to be looking the next time I try non-metallic metal to do smaller highlights and see if that helps me. So with my attempt at non-metallic metal, this is what that section of the armor looks like now. I know that I did a bit of smoothing of this off camera later on, just because I wanted it to try and look even better for this diorama. So I did go and do a bit more later that I don't show. But I did want to be honest and let you know that I do that. Sometimes it's just easier for me to play around off camera. I can take a lot longer. I don't have to worry about filming it, and I can just work back and forward with the paints. It could get a bit confusing if I had to keep showing clips of adding a little bit of this, or fixing a bit of that, or adding a bit more, oh wait, fixing that again. Going back and forward a lot could be really boring, so that's why I don't include it in the videos. As this guy is the villain of my scene, I did want to try and show that in the paint job of the miniature, so I wanted to go for a purple for the cloak because I thought that would make him look evil. For some reason in my mind, all Disney villains are like purple in their design. I know that's not true, but there's a lot of purple on villains generally, and so I was like, yeah, he can be purple, that will make him a villain, and it will also make him look really cool. And I think the purple works really nicely with the greys and the browns. It gives you a nice pop of colour and contrast on this guy. My go-to purple at the moment is Midnight Purple from Vallejo Game Color. It's a really good purple, but also I would just say it's one of the only saturated purples I own. I don't actually have that many paints to choose from, which is why in a lot of my videos you will see me referring to the same paints over and over. It's just because my paint collection isn't that big. I don't have that many dark greys that are near black, so I use charcoal all the time. Every time I need purple, I've pretty much only got a few purples to choose from, so this saturated purple is always a great one to pick. So this is what the cloak looks like when it's done, and now I'm moving on to some of the details on the armor, which I'm going to do in a gold. So once again, I'm going to try a non-metallic metal gold, and once again, I'm also going to use the AK 3rd Gen set for this. Using these sets helps me at this stage in my non-metallic metal journey, where I don't have to focus so much on the color choices. I can do a couple of mixes between the colors, but mainly I can just focus on where I'm placing my highlights. I jump straight from whole red to the Sahara yellow in the set, and then I build up to sand yellow and ice yellow, which are also AK 3rd Gen paints in the set. When it came to placing the highlights on these gold areas, I think I actually got a bit lucky, and I did it a bit better than I thought I would. This turned out really cool in the end, and yeah, I'd love to say it was pure skill, but it was probably also a little bit of luck. But probably is one of the best attempts at gold non-metallic metal I've done so far on any miniature, so that was a plus. When I started painting this miniature, I didn't think I was going to use gold for these details. I thought it would make him look too good, too regal, but gold is actually probably the perfect color for these details because I needed them to be distinct from the silver metals, but I also wanted a color that worked well with the purple, and obviously yellow being a contrasting color of purple makes it an ideal choice. So gold here works really well with the purple, works really well with the silver, and helps blend the whole thing together. As for his regalness, we can probably just explain that away by saying maybe he was the court wizard of some big king somewhere before he turned evil. You can pretty much always generate some kind of headcanon to explain these things. Or just not worry about the details, I guess. Could do that too. The largest core areas of the model are now done, so it's time to paint some of the details. I began with his little flask of liquid, which I painted a nice vibrant green. I used a very dark green, I think it was black green, and then I highlighted it up with Rainforest from Army Painter Fanatic. Then another thing I needed to do was to do his hand. I'd left that because I wasn't sure if I was going to do it skin or leather. In the end, I went with leather. I then covered all of his undergarments parts that I painted first in a blue ink. I just wanted to tint them a little bit more blue. Blue is a similarish colour to purple, so I thought as long as it's not too saturated, it will look okay with the whole rest of the model, and it will tie in with that anthracite grey in the armour. Then I did one final highlight all over all the leather just to bring out some more brightness on the edges of that, and I painted the sword with a bit of dark brown and then red. And with all of those stages done, this is what the miniature looked like. Considering this miniature is going to be placed in the centre of the diorama, it's really important he looks good, and don't look at the back, I didn't paint it, but don't worry, you'll never see it. So next up is the Human Paladin miniature. Because for these two hero miniatures at the front, I was going to be placing them at a very specific angle. When I primed them, I primed a bit of light primer over the side that was going to be facing the person looking at the diorama, so I knew exactly where I needed to bother painting, and so that I didn't have to paint the back where nobody's ever going to see it. I began with undergarments again and just did those in a grey. Used my classic charcoal and then highlighted it up with a lighter grey. I think I went to Stonewall Grey from Vallejo. Next, it was to do his blue kind of cape and leg parts, and I wanted to give him a blue feel because to me that feels very kind of hero paladin type vibes. For the blue sections, I worked from Vallejo Game Colors Night Blue, which is a nice dark blue, and then I used Abyssal Blue from Army Painter Fanatic and Aegis Aqua from Army Painter Fanatic. That gave me a nice transition from very, very dark blue to more greeny blue highlights. After highlighting all of the blue parts, I was a bit scared that there'd be far too much silvery steel metallic. So I chose to paint the other parts of his armor a very light grey, almost white. I thought this would help him look more quintessentially paladin. And while there may be some confusion around the other character in the middle, for these two hero characters, I wanted no confusion. You should be able to look at this guy and know that he's a paladin. Unless you don't know anything about DnD and you don't know what a paladin is anyway. It's just a cool guy with a sword. These miniatures are really similar to the Elf Rogue D&D miniature that I painted way back near the start of my channel a few months ago. And I said clearly in that video that I understand that these miniatures have a place, they are cheaper, they are for people who just want to play in D&D, just to have something to represent them, and that's all good and that's fine, but they are not quite as high quality, and it's kind of really hard to pick out the details. So there was a lot of details on these intricate bits of armor on this guy that I really struggled to see exactly what was going on, and that made it a little bit tricky to highlight some of it. So I did the best I could. My hope for the whole diorama is that no single detail will pull it down, because as an ensemble, the whole thing together will be more than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. In the clips on screen, you'll have noticed I'm now shifted from doing the white armor all the way to doing the gold all around the armor. So I'm once again doing a gold non-metallic metal on this character, but the difference with this character is that there's a lot more of it. I'm basically doing the exact same steps as I did on the previous miniature, where I'm working up through the non-metallic metal gold set from AK 3rd Gen. I wasn't quite as confident with my placement of my highlights on all of these parts, but I think because of the amount of highlights there were, hopefully just the sort of chaoticness of the detail here helps make it look better overall. As I said before, definitely planning on doing some kind of non-metallic metal video or multiple videos in the future. Maybe something like I paint non-metallic metal till my hand falls off or something like that. Let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that if anyone watches this video. After I'd worked through all the stages of the non-metallic metal gold, I decided to do all of the leather straps on this guy. And I wanted this to be really different from the leather on the other character. So the other character used the Army Painter Fanatic leather range with the hexad there that goes to a kind of creamy, light, desaturated highlight. And I wanted the leather on this guy to be much brighter, more orangey, more saturated. So I grabbed Grunge Brown from Game Color and I grabbed light brown from model color to do these highlights. The thought process behind that was that more desaturated highlights would make the leather look more evil for the villain, and more saturated highlights would look more good because it's like the heroes have kept their leather in better condition. I wanted this guy to have a lovely blonde mane of hair, so tried my best to do blonde. Key thing was to make sure it wasn't using the same yellows as the armor gold, but was sort of browny gold enough to actually read as blonde hair. The blonde hair was kind of tricky because the sculpting of the hair on this little miniature is kind of difficult to pick out because it's kind of a messy texture. It's not the super cleanest detail. To get these colors, I think I just mixed the browns that I was using for the leather parts with the yellows and golds that I was using for the non-metallic parts to get something in between that was more like a brown yellow. For the skin on this miniature, I did my usual kind of skin mixtures, which I described in one of my previous videos. But essentially this used succubus skin from Vallejo's game color range, and then I also used elf skin tone and pale flesh from the same range. I focused all of the highlighting just to the side of the face that you'll actually see in the diorama, which was pretty much just half of his face on the left-hand side. There was enough detail, I think, in the eye for me to be able to do a little black dot for a pupil, so I tried that and it came out okay. I painted the sword next, and I used the same paints as I did for the steel metals on the previous miniature, using the same AK 3rd Gen non-metallic metal steel set. I wasn't exactly sure where to place the highlights on the sword. I don't actually know how the reflections would work on something that's being held like that. So I made my best guess at some lines going along the metal and then just tried to blend them as best as I could. And I got something that I thought looked okay. It's not perfect, but it will do. So then that was the paladin finished, and this is what he looks like. All good. So now it's time to move on to the fighter. I think the printing of this miniature is a little bit worse than the other one, so I'm kind of glad that there's a very specific golden angle for this diorama that's going to work, and that's what I'm going to focus on painting once again. This time the fighter's going to get a big dose of red. So on the cape here, I'm using gory red from Vallejo game color, and I'm going to slap that all over and get a nice opaque base coat. Starting this new miniature, I forgot about working each individual part up to completion, as I've been doing with the other miniatures, so just jumped over to base coat all the metals at this point, but we're going to jump straight back to the cape and finish that up next. I just used anthracite grey, similar as for the other parts of steel that I used on the previous miniatures. So going back to the red cape, I now took Scarlet Blood, one of my favourite reds because it's so saturated. Because of that saturation, it doesn't always cover that well, but I'm patient and I can apply multiple layers, so it never bothers me that much. I applied a load of that over the main folds, and then I used Flickering Flame from the Army Painted Fanatic, which is an orangey yellow. And I added that in and used a 1-to-1 mix of my Scarlet Blood mix and the Flickering Flame in order to get something I could highlight all of the edges of the folds with. My edge highlights for these folds ended up being a bit thick, so I went back in with Scarlet Blood and I basically tried to thin them down, make them look less prominent. I used a tiny bit of pure Flickering Flame as a small highlight on the very edges and finest edge lines of the cape. I've said it before, but I really like a nice warm red highlight, so I like to lean more towards orangey yellows for my highlights on reds, rather than going towards a pinkish white. This miniature was overall a bit simpler than the Paladin because I wanted the armor to all be basically one color, rather than the two-tone color of the white and the gold that the Paladin had. So everything was just going to be a steel metal for this, so I used the non-metallic metal steel set once again, and I'm adding here some graphite to the areas to denote a highlight line that goes the whole way down the arm. I've been thinking of the arm as a cylinder, so the highlight would go straight down the middle, as far as I can tell, at least. I moved to silver grey next, began to add that into the area where I put the graphite before, but leaving a bit of graphite on the edges to show. These highlights are actually probably a bit too big with hindsight, so I'm going to reserve the right between now and a future video, or just before the diorama's finished, to come back in and do a little bit of softening of this highlight, maybe make it a bit smaller so that it's not quite so prominent, and that might make this look a little bit more like an actual non-metallic metal. Because of all the non-metallic metals in this video, this arm is the one that's giving me the most kind of not quite right vibes. I tried my best to use silver grey and a mix of the graphite and silver grey to smooth these shoulders as best as I can, and that did help a little bit to make it look better than it did before. After the cape and armor were done, that was the main two core areas of this miniature, so then it was all smaller details, like the handle of the weapon, which I did with the 3 brown colours that I used on the leather for my wizard guy that I painted first, the ones from the Army Painter Fanatic range. Just to add in some other different colours, I painted the boots with the same leather recipe as I did for the leather straps on the Paladin, so the warmer browns that I used, like grunge brown and light brown. And then I painted this orc's hair, and I just used normal greys for that, so it was charcoal, and then working up to stonewall grey as a lighter grey to use for a highlight, picking out the little bits of hair texture that I could. I decided to paint the weapon black because I didn't know what else to use. I didn't want to do gold because it would make everything look the same, and I didn't want to do a different type of metal because I wasn't sure how to do that with non-metallic metal, so I ended up using black and greys to highlight, and I did that just because I thought it would make the weapon look more like it was some kind of like obsidian rock chunk or something, just to give it a bit of difference, make it look special. To paint the skin on the orc, I used brown grey and warm grey from the AK 3rd Gen range, and just created a couple of mixes in between the two colours to try and smooth the transition as it moved around the face. Once again, I only really had to worry about the highlight on this side of the face, closest where you'll actually see it in the diorama, and the other side of the face I could just leave in the shadow colour. I ended up making quite a bit of a mess of the hair and the face, so this took a little while and I did a lot of it off camera, but once I'd smoothed up the face a little bit more, I ended up with something that looked like this, and it started to look a bit nicer. So with the face done, that's pretty much all the details I needed to paint on this orc fighter. So now let's take a look at these miniatures in the structure of the booknook. Once again, it doesn't really make sense to do a spin around because I didn't paint the backs. So you can see here, these are the angles that I'm hoping to have these miniatures at when I glue them down. So I painted everything with that information in mind. From these angles though, the miniatures look fun and there's lots of detail and good contrast, so that's great. And if I chuck in the villain guy where he's roughly going to go in the scene, you can see that the 3 of them together make a pretty good trio. The angles of the 2 front miniatures help make a nice pathway for your eyes to lead straight to the middle villain, and I'm pretty happy with how he turned out, so it's a good focal point between these 2 miniatures. So this has been part 2 of the Booknook series, and part 1 was technically the Beholder one, so I'm going to rename that video after this comes out. And in my next one, I'm going to be painting more of the terrain and seeing what I can put together. And then there might be a 4th final part that just goes through putting all the final touches together and bringing the whole thing into one complete piece. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you'll join me again for my next video.